June 12, 2004. The date sits in my memory with the acute clarity of a photograph. The heat of that June afternoon, the linen that still smelled of starch, the small white envelope I kept for years in the top drawer of my desk. The wedding was supposed to be a hinge of joy and new beginnings. Instead, it exposed a recurring family impulse that had smoldered beneath everyday life for as long as I could remember, a near-reflexive conviction that something was always askew in the world and that it fell to someone, to Mum, most often, to straighten it. We came, belatedly, to call that afternoon the wedding fiasco. The object that made the pattern visible was almost comic in its ordinariness, a plate of food. At the reception, a caterer, under pressure and with a face leaned toward embarrassment, agreed in public to take back portions already served. It was a small, technical reversal, but the gesture carried enormous symbolic weight. Everyone present registered the mistake and, more importantly, our immediate, awkward attempt to repair it. Forks rewrapped at a makeshift distribution point, hurried apologies, faces trying to compose themselves while the air held a new, fragile awareness that something essential had been dented. That single exchange did not erase what had happened. It did, however, reveal a method, a way of moving through error that combined public acknowledgement with private mending. Over the following months and years, those improvised acts hardened into rehearsed practices. A grammar for correction that would be used again and again, a set of small, repeatable motions that kept harm from calcifying into family legend. The consequences of that wedding rippled outward and downward, practical as well as personal. Vendors who had once taken our casual demands for granted now wanted contracts and deposits. Relationships that had been conducted on the basis of old acquaintanceship converted into legally enforceable expectation. The florist who, in a whisper the day of the reception, laced anger into a quiet aside. By spring of 2006, she accepted a commission from my mother for a memorial service and put one line on the invoice that felt like both mercy and permission: people can be different than their worst day. That sentence was an absolution of sorts. It acknowledged the harm yet left room for repair. The florist's change of mind was not born of sudden goodwill. It was a practical recalibration prompted by formal expectations and by the presence of avenues for redress. Incremental change, not conversion, was what we learned had purchase in ordinary life. The months that followed the wedding were defined by a slow professional formalization. We drafted a vendor packet, deposit terms, cancellation windows, a named point of contact, explicit clauses about property and intellectual rights, and started handing it to caterers, florists, photographers, and venues. The paperwork felt heavy at first, then it felt like a shield. It said plainly, no more humiliations by impulse edits. Here are the rules under which we will operate. The packet did two things. It protected vendors, and in protecting them, it constrained the extremes of our family habits. When Mum attempted to take possession of a photographer's negatives in late 2006, the new structure made it possible to respond quickly and decisively. We sought and received a court order in early 2007 to protect property rights. That legal measure was a painful but necessary boundary. It read as failure in one register and as protection in another. The court's ruling established a clear line professionals could rely on. After that decision, vendors felt safer doing business with us, and the temperature of subsequent interactions lowered. Even as we learned to translate pattern into policy, the family work moved inward. By September 2004, we were sitting in a therapist's tidy office, our skepticism thick and reasonable. The idea of mediation, of gathering and speaking in a circle where we named hurts rather than hurling them, felt at first like another ornament on a shelf already cluttered with rituals. The therapist reframed the work as practical training rather than moral reckoning. She gave us exercises and scripts. The lessons were deceptively simple, language and gestures that contained impulses rather than indulging them, how to refuse without turning refusal into combat, how to decline an invitation without collapsing into shame, how to say calmly, I appreciate that you want to help, but we need someone else to handle this. We practiced listening while another person spoke. In one exercise, each of us wrote down what we imagined the other's motives were, then read those notes aloud as if we were that person. The swap was disorienting and revelatory. What I had long called Mum's rules, lists of complaints that had hardened into resentments, softened into a muffled plea, show me I matter. Giving a name to the fear beneath the behavior made strategy possible. Once fear had a name, it could be addressed rather than enabled. The therapist taught usable, repeatable scripts. We learned to make roles specific and boundaries explicit. When Mum felt compelled to reassign tasks at an event, one of us would step forward with a neutral steadiness and say, "Thanks, Mum. We've got this. Could you take these guests to their seats?" The delegation was practical and symbolic. It offered Mum a discrete piece of work with a clear finish line while protecting everyone else from disruptive, last-minute edits. Repetition turned those moves into default reflexes, small interventions that contained trouble before it grew. By the time our son was born in April 2006, these practices were beginning to harden into habit. Parenting in the shadow of Mum's temperament demanded new muscles, less abstract moralizing, more embodied example. When our son turned 3 in April 2009 and told a baker to decorate the cake just like Mama says, I saw a teaching moment. I modeled language and tone. "We can ask the baker to place the candles this way," I said. "We can't ask them to redesign the whole cake now. If we want something different next time, we'll plan ahead." The child watched with the unblinking focus of a small person witnessing a pattern being rewritten. In years that followed as a teenager, he would echo phrases from therapy. "I appreciate your help, but ask me first," when he disputed with friends. No single conversation changed everything. What mattered was accumulation. Asking for something and demanding it are different acts, and I wanted him to absorb that distinction in ordinary choices. Some repairs required more than language. The vendor packet was one piece of a visible bureaucracy that protected suppliers and made community acceptance possible. Alongside it, we introduced operational routines for family events, designate a single logistics lead, set clear arrival windows, and establish signals for when a suggested change should be deferred. The paperwork and these protocols acted as both shield and promise. They made it easier for outsiders to enter our family life without becoming targets of sudden authority grabs. The presence of a clear written agreement turned fear into predictable pattern. Vendors could sign on and know the consequence for violation. Legal intervention, as the court order in early 2007 showed, had limits. In 2008, a cousin suggested cutting Mum out of family events altogether. The proposal came from a raw place, anger and fear, and had a primitive, immediate appeal. Exclusion is efficient. It ends risk. For a moment I considered it. We consulted a family lawyer who offered counsel of a different order. She pointed out the slippery slope between setting boundaries and expunging someone from family life. The law, she argued, is appropriate for clear harms and exploitations. It is disproportionate when meddling stems from habit rather than malice. Confronted with that legal and moral nuance, we resolved to use law only as a last resort, to reserve it for tangible harms, not discomfort. The negatives incident remained an exception, not a rule. We wanted consequences to be intelligible and proportional, protect suppliers, reinforce industry standards, and preserve access when possible. The deepest work happened in small, sometimes tedious acts. Therapy's exercises became scripts we carried into public life. We rehearsed phrases for high-stakes moments. "We appreciate your thought. For this event we have one logistic lead. Please check with them." We practiced what to do if Mum crossed an agreed line, pull her aside, remind her gently of her delegated role, and if she persisted, use a short public phrase that diffused escalation. That discipline did two things. First, it shielded guests from family drama. Second, it taught Mum by repeated example that attention need not confer authority. Repetition turned these moves into rituals that contained trouble before it became spectacle. Mum's impulse shifted as she aged. The need to commandeer a table setup less often took the form of aggression and more often became insistence on storytelling about indispensability. She would interrupt events to recount how once her presence had turned the tide of a dinner, or how an aunt had demanded center stage and how she had responded. Sometimes the recollections were precise, sometimes they softened into nostalgia. What they consistently carried was a longing to matter. We learned to honor that need without letting it disrupt. In 2010 we invited her to document family recipes, to write letters to grandchildren, and to sort and caption photographs. These projects channeled her hunger for centrality into tasks with deliverables and deadlines. When she wrote Sunday sauce on an index card and added a margin note, "Use more wine for guests who like it loud," she had translated the desire to be central into something others could hold. The stained, annotated cards became artifacts, tangible evidence of her belonging that did not require surrendering autonomy. Setbacks persisted, because habit is stubborn. On a bright spring morning in April 2012, Mum arrived unannounced at my office, claiming she had some files to drop off for a charity. The receptionist called me. I drove back with irritation threaded through a resigned patience. We sat in the car while I named the behavior plainly. Surprise visits to workplaces were inappropriate. My tone was stern but kind. She listened, sometimes shifting as if my words had weight. A week later she returned with a small potted plant and a typed note that read, "For your desk, so you don't forget to breathe." It was clumsy, but it was conscious. She had thought about how to show care without reasserting authority. That effort mattered more to me than any grand apology. Grief complicated the systems we had built. In May 2011, my father-in-law's health began a steady decline. Wills and powers of attorney, insisted upon after the wedding, were in place. Paperwork was ready. Yet documents cannot contain sorrow. Medical decisions, housing conversations, and the brittle nostalgia illness in flames required more than forms. They required negotiation, patience, and delegated responsibilities. The pattern we had identified, fear disguised as helpfulness, reappeared. Mum swung between dutiful caregiver and a woman terrified of losing her voice. She attempted to rearrange doctors' calendars and asked to renegotiate care packages as if meticulous coordination could stall the passage of time. We set rules and assigned roles to navigate that season. At a family meeting in July 2011, Mum was included in the design of the care plan but given bounded authority. She would manage phone calls from distant relatives requesting updates, a task demanding patience and repetition that fit her restless energy, while my husband or I handled medication schedules and home care contracts. The role was not a slight, it was trust placed in a defined authority. It gave her a visible, valued place without opening the door to logistical vetoes. When my father-in-law died in December 2011, we relied on calendars, point person lists, and a shared agreement that one person, my husband by temperament and craft, would coordinate public logistics. His steadiness and capacity to negotiate with cemetery staff, call speakers, and organize seating charts provided a stabilizing force in those weeks when grief threatened to become the currency of old arguments. Those systems did not erase heartache, they made it navigable. When disputes erupted over the funeral playlist, the order of speakers, or who would recite a poem, we invoked the rules. Nominate a single point person, defer to the established timeline, and settle remaining preferences privately. Guilt and sorrow remained abrasive companions, but the structures kept them from becoming the only language we used. I began to notice how ordinary kindness catalyzed change more reliably than dramatic confrontation. When Mum prefaced suggestions with, "If it's not too much trouble," she practiced a new syntax of humility. When she sat quietly at a recital and applauded without attempting to redirect the program, she rehearsed a role that abandoned domination. These small shifts changed how people responded. Invitations followed. People felt safe. The cumulative effect was palpable. Fewer public spectacles, fewer burned bridges, more reasons for neighbors and friends to maintain connection. We adopted a simple private rule for public situations that felt radical in its restraint. Name the pattern, step back, do not escalate. If Mum overstepped at an event, one of us would intervene with a short neutral phrase, "Thanks, Mum. We'll take care of that." No argument. No spectacle. If the breach demanded repair, we handled it later in private. This discipline shielded guests from drama and taught Mum, by consistent demonstration, that attention did not equal authority. Holding that balance required us to think in ledgers. We kept a running account of trust, deposits and withdrawals. There were deposits. A careful phone call from Mum to an elderly relative, a recipe card with flour smudged in the corner, a quiet afternoon she spent helping a neighbor. There were withdrawals. An unexpected confrontation forcing an apology, a vendor refusing to work without strict terms, tense funeral planning meetings. Speaking in credits and debits stopped us from collapsing Mum into a caricature. She was neither villain nor saint. She was a person of contradictions, capable of both harm and generosity. Holding that complexity made it possible to maintain ties without enabling harm. Repair settled into rhythms and artifacts. Mum's recipes collected into a single box, Handwritten cards, stained and annotated, became archival objects to be turned over and read like family scripture. She labeled one Sunday sauce in a looping hand and annotated it, "Stir with patience." Photograph albums became another refuge for dignity. She arranged and captioned old images with the same dogged attention she once applied to seating charts. When she wrote a one-page note to future grandchildren about summer picnics and the balance of lemonade and shade, she offered a piece of herself that none of us had to defend. Not all changes were organic, some required deliberate rehearsal. We practiced prepared lines for high-stakes situations, language that named responsibility without blame, scripts that deflected escalation, fallback phrases for public use. Those rehearsals sounded mechanical at first, but over time they acquired moral weight. A practiced etiquette became a promise kept. People noticed the difference between households that shrugged and households that rehearsed habits into civility. I learned to identify motives and tailor responses accordingly. Sometimes Mum's impulse to fix came from raw anxiety, other times it was performative, intended to display competence. If anxious, a simple reassurance sufficed, "We have this covered." If performative, we redirected her energy to tasks with clear arcs and endpoints. When neither approach worked, a firmer boundary was required. Those boundaries were painful. They demanded courage to hold someone's hurt while enforcing limits. In practice, though, they tended to produce better outcomes than dramatic exclusion. Episodes in 2017 tested that principle anew. A cousin again proposed a legal solution to cut Mum out of family life. I resisted with more clarity than I had in 2008. Exclusion is seductive. It ends immediate risk but severs the possibility of repair. We chose inclusion, bounded by written operating agreements for events, arrival windows, who would manage logistics, and simple signals for when Mum should recede. She agreed. At a small reunion she practiced the new script, offered a suggestion, and then sat back. Watching her, I felt both gratitude and lingering nervousness. Trust rebuilt required vigilance, not naivete. The private reckonings that followed these episodes were more revealing than any public measure. Late at night on the back steps, Mum would tell stories from her childhood that explained but did not excuse. She spoke of her own mother rearranging guests at Sunday dinners, of an aunt who commanded attention, of small scenes in which control had been a strategy against disappearing. Listening did not erase grievance, it enriched understanding. Over time I stopped seeking a clean before and after. I learned instead to look for trajectories, lines that bent through intention and habit, sometimes toward harm and sometimes toward repair. Watching Mum tend roses became another lesson. Her hands moved with practiced economy. She knew which stems to cut and which to preserve. She understood that too many cuts would kill what she loved. That attentiveness was not timid, it was deliberate and disciplined. Pruning came to stand for a new way of loving, not by rearranging other people's lives but by cultivating small things day after day until evidence of growth appears. Her gestures acquired an economy, less theatricality, more deliberation. We developed a shared pragmatic language, point person, check-ins, boundary statement, no public edits. The phrases were utilitarian, dull in their utility, but they were safety cables. The ordinariness was the point. Reparation is rarely spectacular. It is repetition, small apologies tied to change, new scripts tried until they feel natural, trust rebuilt through daily increments. There were moments that felt cinematic only because they were otherwise ordinary. On April 22, 2016, our son's 10th birthday, Mum arrived with a homemade banner, its folds proof of planning done against wind and sun. She moved between helping with games and sitting beside another grandparent nursing a sore knee. When she noticed a boy eyeing a prize on the table, she bent down and handed it to him without fuss. The boy's grin was immediate and unadorned. From across the yard I watched and felt old memories tighten and loosen at once. No one needed to police her that day. She had shown up in bounded, useful ways. The party moved on without drama. That quiet generosity mattered more to me than any public contrition might have. The wedding story itself changed in the telling. For years I liked to retell it with a certain flourish, partly for entertainment, partly to ease a stubborn wound. As time passed, the narrative arc shifted toward repair. It is no longer an accusation that defines Mum, nor a wound we reopen daily. It is a chapter that taught us about control and the labor of repair. If asked whether I would relive the past differently, my answer is steady. I would insist on the practical measures that proved protective: contracts, designated point persons, explicit lines of authority. I would also invite Mum to events I wanted her at. Exclusion is easy. Inclusion with boundaries does the real work. Designing a place for her felt the braver choice. Mending what control tore is not a single dramatic act. It is the slow accumulation of behaviors that say without fanfare, I will be here, I will respect what is yours, I will repair what I break. That is daily fidelity, not a tidy moral with heroes and villains. It is attention, naming patterns when they appear, negotiating roles so a family's life can continue with fewer ruptures. The wedding taught us how easily power disguises itself as help. The years that followed taught us how structure can enable compassion. We chose to keep showing up, to keep shaping boundaries, and to keep offering chances for repair. That decision has made our family less flashy and more durable. It has not removed memory, nor made us forget the harm. It has, however, given us language and tools to live together without turning every gathering into a battleground. There is a recurring image that holds the story together for me. Mum inside the small rectangular space of a table, hands adjusting a napkin until it sits right, the world beyond the table moving in its own trajectory. For years that image carried irritation and impatience. Over time it softened into something like acceptance. I began to see a person who loved order and believed, by action, that arranging the world properly could make it safer. That belief was both her strength and her harm. It made her a reliable organizer and, at times, a person capable of making others' lives intolerably small in the name of improvement. Repair meant teaching those ordering muscles to work in different places, in margins, on tasks with clear endpoints, and in the quiet technology of asking, "Would you like me to help with that?" rather than declaring, "I will fix this." Private reckonings softened the edges of blame. I learned how to hold love and disappointment for the same person without collapsing into cynicism. Separating affection from expectation felt like permission. I could love Mum and not expect her always to be benign. I could be proud of improvements without mistaking them for perfection. That recalibration, accepting repair as practice rather than verdict, was perhaps the most adult part of our story. The ledger of trust was never fully balanced, but it was being rewritten, line by line. Our son absorbed these lessons in his own way. As he grew, conversations shifted from cake permissions to moral contours, the difference between influence and command, between caring and coercion. We framed the wedding as parable: people will try to fix you, and their fixes sometimes break you. We paired it with a counter-narrative: people can change when given compassionate limits. Accountability is not a final sentence but an ongoing practice. Once, when a friend complained about a parent's interference, our son offered a phrase we had rehearsed in therapy: "You can say you appreciate their help, but you need them to ask first." Hearing him speak like that was a small triumph. It proved that behaviors, not just admonitions, pass between generations. The ledger of trust continued to be written in small acts. Mum left notes with phrasing that grew less imperious and more modest. She prepared food with scaled measurements and margin notes about patience. She called when silence would have been easier. She left a recipe card, flour smudged at the edge, labeled Sunday sauce. She pruned roses with practiced economy. None of these gestures signaled a perfect conversion. They were evidence instead of a subtle architecture of presence: less theatricality, more deliberation. Late at night, we still trace memory like a map. She remembers rearranging a table. I remember that moment as inflection and instruction. We compare notes and sometimes cry. More often, we let the conversation settle like tea. Repairs are rarely grand statements. They are quiet acts: an apology tucked into a note, a phone call made when silence would have been easier, a recipe given with scaled measurements, and a margin note about patience. They are the ways a need to be central is translated into things other people can enjoy without forfeiting their autonomy. In the end, the story is not an elegy nor an encomium. It is a practical history of how one family learned to keep being a family despite a pattern that repeatedly threatened to undo gatherings and bonds. We chose inclusion shaped by clear lines, roles, scripts, boundaries, over exclusion. We did not choose the easy options. We chose instead the possibility that someone who had caused pain could become, through repeated modest acts, a different kind of presence in our lives. That decision has made our family less flashy and more durable. It has allowed memory and harm to coexist with repair and small, steady acts of care. In that weary, grateful choice I find a kind of peace. The wedding itself, the episode that first made control a domestic verb in our family, happened years before our son was born. It is one of those incidents that can be dated by the people who remember it rather than the calendar. For me, the clearest chronological anchor is different, our son's birth in 2006, which made the wedding feel already like an artifact of a previous era. Even so, the wedding specifics have a stubborn clarity. It unfolded on a late summer afternoon, the kind of day that insists on being remembered for weather: bright, a little humid, sunlight pooling in the chapel windows and sliding over a tablescape that someone had labored over for weeks. What people forget, or choose not to dwell upon, is the small, premeditated sabotage that happened behind my back. Mum did not storm the aisle or deliver an improvised speech. Her move was less theatrical and therefore at first harder to see. 2 days before the ceremony, she called the florist. She was polite on the phone. She spoke in a voice trained on persuasion. "Oh, your arrangements are lovely," she said, "but I worry about the height on the centerpieces. The sunlight will make it hard for people to see each other." She suggested alternatives: lower vases, different ribbon, a substitution of a flower she favored. When the florist explained that the designs had been approved and paid for by me and that the proposals were finalized, Mum offered to pick up the tab for the extra labor. It was, in her mind, a harmless correction, a tweak toward beauty, a small adjustment that would make the whole thing right. Behind that polite request was a pattern we had seen before, an impulse to improve by interposing her taste and authority between the work and the people for whom it had been done. The florist, eager to please and swayed by money and by the warmth of Mum's voice, agreed to make alterations at the last minute. The vendor did what vendors do when they encounter a client who is insistent and who seems to speak with authority: they accommodated. On the morning of the wedding, the coordinator walked into the ballroom and found the centerpieces shorter, the ribbons different, the overall balance altered. The coordinator had been given a specific seating plan and a sightline arrangement that catered to visibility for older guests and for our photographer's intended shots. The florist's amendments, requested by Mum, compromised that plan. The coordinator called Mum over in a quiet corridor where the florists were packing up tools, and the conversation became public. In that way disputes become public at events, with little audience, with rising voices, with a bride watching the edges. Mum's expectation that a private correction would register as a gift collided with a different reality. The event had already been designed around constraints we had set. Her intervention displaced the authority we had given to the planner, and it called into question the order of responsibility written into the contracts everyone had signed. The coordinator, who had a small credo about contract fidelity, refused to allow further edits without my explicit consent. Mum, surprised that her friendly suggestion had been rebuffed, insisted she had only wanted to help. The florists, who had already made the changes, argued that they had done so because someone had asked them to. The argument pivoted on authority. Who gets to change what when the event is underway? What Mum walked into that day was not just a rebuke. She walked into a rigid, enforced clarity that had been absent until then. The vendor community we were working with, planners, florists, caterers, brought a kind of structural authority that my family had not yet learned how to respect. Where family tactics had been persuasive, the vendor's response was contractual. They refused to work around last-minute unilateral alterations because their agreements and their reputations were at stake. In that refusal, there was an unexpected lesson. External structure could hold the line where family feelings could not. The immediate aftermath was messy. There were tears, though not the telenovela type. There were terse phone calls. I remember feeling a combination of humiliation and clarity. Humiliation because Mum had done something she thought was helpful without telling me. Clarity because the vendor's refusal revealed what we could put in place to prevent the next rupture. Contracts mattered. Point persons mattered. The coordinator's insistence on fidelity to the plan, and the florist's quiet compliance with her direction despite Mum's money, became a boundary made manifest. We had, for once, someone else's boundaries to point at when pity tempted us to forgive without protecting. That wedding did long-term damage, yes, but it also triggered structural innovations that formed the backbone of our later repair work. In the years that followed, I began to insist on written operating agreements for events. The language was prosaic and dull at first: arrival windows, clear statements of authority, small signal protocols for when Mum should step back. But the boring language was generative. On the day of a reception in 2012, when Mum hovered near the head table fiddling with a napkin, the coordinator, who had seen our file and my request for a no public edits policy, gently waved her off with a phrase Mum had come to accept: "We've got this, there's a plan in place." That day the napkin stayed in the place it had been set. Nothing dramatic happened, no one called a lawyer, the party moved on. The intervening years produced episodes that varied in intensity. In 2008, after a particularly volatile Thanksgiving in which Mum rearranged seating charts and openly corrected a visiting aunt's cooking, a cousin suggested a legal fix, a written agreement to cut her out of family decision-making. That proposal, advanced by someone younger and less forgiving of ambivalence, briefly drew a line on the calendar and on our conscience. We considered it. We rejected it. Exclusion is easy in moral arithmetic, its sums add up quickly. But it severs the possibility of repair in a way that feels more like an amputation than a treatment. In resisting the cousin's counsel, we made a deliberate, if fraught, choice. We would build scaffolding to allow Mum to remain in our lives on new terms. 2016 and 2017 were pivotal in different ways. On April 22, 2016, our son turned 10. Mum showed up with a banner she had made by hand, its folds and flourishes evidence of planning done in the margins. For that day she was contained by the script we had written together in private. She could decorate, she could sit next to an ailing grandparent, she could help hand out prizes, but she agreed to avoid the head table and not to intervene in games. We watched her, and she watched the children. The day passed with small, luminous moments. The boy who received a prize because she had noticed him, the grandparents trading jokes. It was, in many ways, the kind of small success that makes the work feel worth continuing. But success was never linear. Episodes in 2017 tested the scaffolding. The cousin who had once recommended a legal solution proposed it again in different words, suggesting that we formalize a guardianship-like arrangement that would prevent Mum from being alone in charge of any familial arrangement. We resisted more clearly this time. Our reaction had hardened not into stubbornness but into a principle: inclusion with boundaries. We responded by tightening the language of our operating agreements and making the consequences of overreach visible and predictable. If Mum crossed a boundary, there would be an agreed-upon response: a private call, a written apology, a restorative task. The point was not punishment so much as restoration, a way for her to repair harm in forms that did not reproduce control. Therapy helped too. Beginning in late 2017, we asked Mum to join 1 or 2 sessions with a family therapist we trusted. We did not do this to shame, we did it to develop a shared vocabulary and to practice the new scripts in a place that felt safe and neutral. There, under the watchful yet gentle coaxing of a clinician, she learned to translate her impulses into offers rather than edicts. "Would you like me to help with that?" became a phrase she tried aloud, stumbled over, and eventually used without the old imperious inflection. The therapist drew attention to pattern and motive in ways that our private conversations struggled to do. It was the therapist who gave Mum language for the childhood scenes she was still reshaping. "I was guarding against being invisible," she said in one session. Naming did not excuse, but it made change intelligible. Practical rituals followed. By 2018 we had an event checklist that vendors and family members received at every gathering. Who is the point person? Who checks the lighting? What are the no-edit zones? What is the escalation ladder? Vendors began to learn our family by way of the checklist. Florists and caterers appreciated clarity. Planners liked that someone would not be surprises mid-shift. Mum learned to consult the list before acting. There were slip-ups. In 2019 she swapped a playlist at a small anniversary party without consulting the DJ, and the DJ, who valued control, politely reverted to the scheduled songs and placed a polite, frank text on my phone: "If someone asks to change the set, send the point person." That short message felt almost celebratory. Systems were holding. The arrival of the pandemic in early 2020 tested the architecture of boundaries in another way. With gatherings curtailed and rituals moved online, New anxieties produced old impulses. Mum called more often. She offered to coordinate Zoom links, to vet family group chats, to run guest lists virtually. At first her tendency to merge concern with command threatened to disrupt the new, fragile normal. But the digital moment also provided opportunities for iterative repair. We sent a revised set of operating statements that addressed virtual norms: who moderates, how to handle mute, where the chat etiquette lives. Mum adapted. She learned to announce that she would host a pre-call 5 minutes early and to ask each participant if they wanted to be unmuted. On a chilly April evening in 2020, we had a family Zoom where she read a recipe from the Sunday sauce card she had scribbled on years earlier. She held up a wooden spoon to the camera and winked. The small, mundane gestures had regained some of their warmth. There were still public ruptures. In 2021, at my mother's 81st birthday, as we gathered the family in a local hall, a distant cousin who had never warmed to our compromise tried to provoke a reprise, reminding Mum in full hearing of her worst offenses. For a moment the room tilted toward old grievance. But we had rehearsed responses. The son, now 15, stood up and said, without drama, "We've got ground rules for this celebration. If you want to raise old arguments, schedule a time with Mum and me later." His voice was steady. He used the phrase we had learned in therapy: "I appreciate that history, but I need you to ask first." The cousin sputtered at first and then, perhaps embarrassed, fell quiet. The party resumed with cake and quiet conversation. That scene, a teenager enforcing household norms, felt both ordinary and astonishing. It was evidence that the labor of repair had reached a new generation. Through these years, Mum's gestures continued to change in scale. She left fewer imperious notes and more modest ones. The margin notes on recipes began to belong to the event rather than to her instruction manual. She took pleasure in small, repetitive tasks that had an end: polishing spoons for the Sunday table, pruning a rose bush until its form pleased her. Her apologies became shorter and more frequent, less theatrical and more disciplined. She took on reparative chores, writing emails to apologize after an overstep, volunteering to pick up a cake rather than rearranging seating charts, phoning a cousin she had offended and reading aloud the words she had practiced in therapy. Not all acts of repair worked. There were regressions: a burst of control at a funeral in 2022, a sharp correction of a friend's dress at a retirement party, a brusque phone call that reopened old sores. Each time the family invoked the scripts we had agreed upon: a private call, a practice statement, a restorative task. Sometimes Mum resisted, sometimes she complied. Often we were imperfect. The ledger of trust did not balance neatly. But what changed, measurably and visibly, was the set of supports around the ledger. Where once her impulse could rearrange an entire event, there was now a safety cable: the planner's contract, the vendor's fidelity to the plan, the son's practiced phrase, the therapist's notes, the RSVP-driven guest list that named a point person. Over a dozen years the story acquired a new texture. It is no longer primarily about the day of the wedding, nor merely a parable of parental overreach. It is an account of institutionalizing compassion. We learned, through repeated failure and iterative success, how to create environments that protect autonomy without excising attachment. Dates anchor the story: 2006, our son's birth; April 22, 2016, the 10th birthday in which Mum stayed within the script; 2017, when we resisted exclusion and rewrote our operating agreements; 2020, when the pandemic forced our norms online. But the real chronology is behavioral. It is measured in the number of times someone asked, "Would you like me to help?" instead of declaring, "I will fix this." It is recorded in the margins of recipe cards and on the edges of a pruned rosebush. There remains a stubborn ambivalence in how I tell the tale. Sometimes I tell it as proof that people can change if the conditions are right. Sometimes I narrate it as a cautionary chronicle: power can cloak itself as care, and even well-intentioned fixes can displace the people they meant to help. I do both because both perspectives are true. We did not choose the easy path. We chose, instead, the harder work of keeping someone who had harmed us in our lives while redesigning the ways she could show up. That choice required patience, small rituals of accountability, and an acceptance that repair would never be a singular victory. The wedding that began this story became, over time, an emblem and an object lesson. Mum's covert call to the florist that day was a small act with outsized consequences. What she walked into, a vendor's refusal to be commandeered, turned out to be a kind of salvation. It gave us a model for how families can design limits that preserve connection. The years since have been the slow work of building those models into habit, creating point persons, writing boundary statements, insisting on no public edits. We have, in the process, learned to hold love and disappointment side by side and to insist that affection need not mean surrendering authority over one's life. We continue to prune, to cook, to make banners and to set places at tables, mindful now that arranging the world is a skill that must be learned as much as inherited, shaped by practice and by the occasional, merciful refusal of a vendor to do someone's bidding. After the vendor said no that afternoon, the florist, her hands full of peonies and ranunculus, calmly refusing to rearrange the head table on the spot, there was a curious quiet. That refusal was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no social media posts. It was a professional boundary enforced with the language of contracts and common sense. We designed to the plan we agreed, the florist said, and handed back the phone. What we felt then, and what we have learned to name since, was relief. Not because someone had been denied something, but because a small, necessary trunk of authority had been returned to its rightful owner, the couple who had organized the day. When I tell the story now, the florist's refusal sounds like an inflection point. April 9, 2006 might be the prodromal date of the whole family saga, but the real turning moment for us was that wedding and the uncomplicated procedural no we were offered. That no, uttered in the middle of a ballroom, had practical utility beyond the ceremony itself. In the months that followed, we translated what had happened into tools. Contracts were rewritten with language that referenced point person by name and included a clause for unsolicited requests. Planners added a paragraph that vendors could show to any overreaching guest. The document didn't feel like a legalistic imposition, it felt like armor. Vendors liked it because it protected the integrity of the event. We liked it because it created a visible barrier to impulsive commandeering. By late 2016, our roster of regulars, caterers, DJs, florists, photographers, had begun to carry printed copies of our family operating statements in their kits. The statements read like a small constitution: who decides the timeline, who authorizes changes, what counts as an emergency. On the edges of those documents we wrote the sentence that had guided us since 2017, if in doubt, call the point person. The work of making systems is not merely administrative, it is also moral labor. Systems give shape to values. We did not erect our checklists because we wanted to control the joy of others. We built them because our family had learned, sometimes painfully, that love expressed as direction can crush autonomy. Each clause in a contract was a reminder that affection is not a license to assume. The vendor's no taught us to accept external refusal as a form of kindness. That lesson carried through to smaller moments: the son's 15th birthday in 2021, the Sunday meals, the holiday menus. By then Mum had stopped leaving long imperative notes at the foot of our bed in favor of sticky reminders at the fridge that said, "Ask before changing." She wrote "ask" with a question mark, as if she were practicing the shape of humility. Still, the scaffolding never made us invulnerable to relapse. In March 2022, when an elderly aunt died, a kind of panic seized the room. Funerals compress decades into a few grey hours, and old hierarchies reassert themselves. Mum, who had been schooled in discretion, reverted to an old pattern. She corrected a cousin's eulogy mid-prayer and stepped into the officiant's space. We activated the script: private call, restorative task, but grief distorts appetite for repair. The son, now 16, sat at the back and observed. Later he told me that he had seen my mother shrink a bit in that room, that she had looked eager for direction and then, when not given it, had reached for the only shape she knew. We did restorative work in its aftermath: phone calls, an apology that she read aloud and then posted in the family group chat, and a small task: 3 handwritten notes she promised to send to grieving cousins. The pattern was familiar. There was error, accountability, and then sometimes a recalibration. The recalibration became more formal in 2023. The combination of aging and accumulated incidents prompted a conversation we had once resolutely avoided. What does assistance look like when independence begins to waver? We were not talking about guardianship, that legal boundaried form that had been proposed by a cousin in 2017 and rejected, but rather about a set of voluntary, narrowly scoped agreements: a health proxy limited to logistical coordination, a trusted neighbor who could help with appointments, and a calendared event liaison who would, with Mum's consent, field event-related calls. Mum agreed to sign a limited power of attorney for event logistics. It was not about taking away her rights, but about enabling her to consent to being contained. The documents were signed in a day in late spring, a quiet, ordinary bureaucratic act that none of us dramatized. It mattered because it permitted us to point to an agreed-upon authority during tense moments. The event liaison has the contract, we could say, and Mum could hear it as permission rather than exclusion. The son's growth through these years has been one of the more decisive features of the story. Born in 2006, he bore the early burden of our disputes with a child's hum of annoyance and later with a teenager's firm, if sometimes weary, insistence on clarity. By 2024, at 18, he had become the kind of person whose voice could de-escalate a room simply by naming a protocol. At his high school graduation, a luncheon his mother insisted on rearranging into a sit-down dinner. A relapse into the old imperative was averted by a single text he sent to the planner: "Please proceed as contracted." The planner, who had worked with us since 2018 and had come to rely on the checklist we circulated, sent back a thumbs up and then a note to Mum that read more gently than it needed to: "We want this to be what you want too. Let's keep the plan." Mum laughed later about how useful a thumbs up can be. Her laugh was not defensive but small and grateful. We have learned to celebrate those small, ordinary victories. Vendors continued to be surprisingly powerful allies. In 2019, the DJ's frank text, "If someone asks to change the set, send the point person," read like a manifesto in miniature. By the mid-2020s, it was not unusual for vendors to codify in their public materials a clause that protected them from being used as instruments in private fights. A catering company wrote into its brochure, "We serve the client of record," a line that helped friends and neighbors understand that event professionals are not neutral parties to family disputes but rather guardians of contract and consent. These clauses were not punitive, they were stabilizing. They dissolved the private drama that otherwise converts every family event into a contest of wills. Yet this reliance on external authority also presented moral questions. When does delegating authority to vendors, the strangers who know the rhythm of a ballroom or the weight of a cake, displace the real work of internal reformation? We worried about outsourcing our boundaries to professionals. If the florist or the DJ becomes the one to say no, do we risk relieving family members of the responsibility to change? The answer we arrived at was that vendor refusal is necessary but not sufficient. It stabilizes the moment. It does not substitute for the slow work of change inside a person. That internal work, therapy, practice, ritual, remains essential. We kept experimenting with rituals. In 2024, we adopted a practice we called pre-ceremony walkthroughs, a 15-minute meeting 48 hours before any event where key family members and vendors met in person or on Zoom to go through the timeline. It became a rehearsal not only of logistics but of tone. Mum would arrive with a small paper she had written, usually apologetic and often funny: "I promise to hold my tongue unless asked." The practice turned the boundary into a social custom rather than an imposition. There were moments of levity. Mum sometimes wrote marginal jokes to no one in particular, but the ritual was, in effect, training her muscles for restraint. There were still missteps that felt like old ghosts. In late 2025, at a small friend's wedding, Mum intercepted a bouquet arrangement with the intention of adding a ribbon that matched a dress she loved. The florist called my phone. The script worked. I called Mum privately, asked her to explain her idea, and then read the pre-agreed phrase she had practiced in therapy. "That's a lovely thought. Would you like to help with the favors instead?" And she laughed and accepted. The moment was almost comically ordinary, a tiny reprise of the larger pattern. The laugh mattered. Laughter is an odd metric of repair. It indicates not just acquiescence but a degree of internalization. She had learned to hear, "Would you like to help?" as an invitation rather than a rebuke. Outside of parties, the architecture we had built also helped in crises. In 2022, an unexpected hospital stay required coordination that could have become chaotic. The event liaison we had designated in 2023 stepped in, calling vendors to adjust food orders, notifying neighbors about rides, and sending a succinct group text that outlined tasks and expectations. The message, clear, procedural, and non-judgmental, kept relational friction at bay. Mum, in her hospital bed, later told us that being organized had felt like mercy. We had come, haltingly, to understand that structure can be a gift, it can be a way of preserving dignity in flux. All of this does not mean the story has been simple or linear. There have been times when the ledger seems to slide back into imbalance, a bruised feeling after an apology that seemed too perfunctory, a cousin who reads an old note and finds it unforgivable, a vendor who misreads a clause and creates new anxiety. What has changed is not that harm no longer occurs, but that the harm is no longer usually catastrophic. It is bounded and therefore reparable. The scaffolds, contracts, checklists, a practiced family vocabulary, therapy, the son's firm voice, have not cured old inclinations, but they have made them manageable. In telling this part of the story, I am conscious of the hazards. It could sound triumphalist, as though we have fixed what was once broken, or it could read as a melancholy litany of small concessions. Both readings contain truth. There is joy when a mother learns to fold a banner and hand it over without a flourish. There is grief when apologies are necessary more often than we thought. I remind myself that repair is not a destination but a discipline. It requires repetition, forgetting, and trying again. Looking back to the early years, the wedding that catalyzed everything, the florist's steady refusal, the DJ's terse text in 2019, the pandemic's reconfiguration of gatherings in 2020, the 81st birthday in 2021 when a teenager enforced household norms, the funeral ruptures in 2022, the limited power of attorney in 2023. We see a narrative not of guilt turned to absolution but of persistent, often imperfect labor. Those dates are not merely markers, they are chapters in a process that continues to unfold. They demonstrate how institutional forms, contracts, vendor policies, legal tools, can be combined with the soft work of apology and the harder cognitive labor of changing a habit. As Mum edges toward her mid-80s, the registers of our work shift again. We have conversations now about the future that are not only about who arranges flowers or who sits at the head table, but about the daily architecture of care. We discuss how to structure decisions so that autonomy is maximized while risk is minimized. We revisit the idea of guardianship not as a punitive instrument but as a last resort safety net. We consider, with deliberate slowness, whether the limited powers we put in place will remain adequate. These conversations are mundane and necessary. They are the kind of end-of-life administrative work people rarely tell stories about because they lack drama. But they are also, perhaps, the most important part of the story, how to keep a relationship loving when one party needs scaffolding. We still collect small stories that feel like proof that the labor is doing what we hoped. Once, while arranging seating for a small family dinner in 2025, Mum scripted a note and asked me to read it aloud. "I am learning to be a guest in my own plans," she wrote, and then she added, in handwriting that had grown steadier over the years, "Thank you for making me useful." She meant it. There is grace in being allowed to be helpful without prescribing the help. The vendor who refuses a commandeering request, the planner who insists on a point person, the son who texts a DJ to remind him of the plan. All these are pieces of a culture we have tried to build, a culture of consent and shared authority. The story of the wedding that began it all is now, more than anything, a story about the durability of constraints. Boundaries are not punitive fences but scaffolds that allow people to grow into healthier ways of being. The phrase that guided us through so many awkward, tender moments, "Would you like to help?" is now almost a family reflex. It has become a rehearsed phrase that opens possibility rather than closes it. And yet the work remains unfinished. We continue to negotiate, to disappoint, to repair, and to learn. The vendor's original refusal was a quiet act that redirected a moment. Our job is to make sure that refusal was not merely coincidence but a lesson that has taken root, shaping how we will gather, love, and live together in the years ahead. By the time the calendar turned to 2026, the patterns we had cultivated felt less like ad hoc damage control and more like a nascent family jurisprudence. In March of that year we convened what we half-jokingly called the Family Council, an intentional meeting that followed the logic of the pre-ceremony walkthroughs but applied it to life planning. It took place in my living room on a damp Tuesday evening. Mum arrived with 2 thermoses of tea and a handwritten agenda. We reviewed the limited power of attorney we had executed in 2023, examined the living will she had initialed in 2024, and made modest edits to account for new contingencies. A clause specifying our event liaison as the default point person for public gatherings, an addendum that named alternate vendors who had agreed to respect a client of record rule, and a note about involving the son in any decisions affecting his college finances should Mum become too frail to weigh in. The council did not feel momentous, but it was significant for its ordinariness. It codified the expectation that decisions would be made according to procedures we had been testing in the field since the florist incident at our wedding. By then the industry had begun to notice. In late 2025, a regional venue chain instituted a policy requiring a designated decision-maker on any contract over a certain monetary threshold. In early 2026, a professional association of caterers circulated template language that mirrored what our planner had long used. We will take direction from the designated client of record and the named event liaison. These changes mattered because they removed ambiguity at the institutional level. They made it harder for an aggrieved family member to press a vendor into acting as arbitrator. Despite these systemic gains, the private work continued. Mum's therapist introduced a framed set of exercises in early 2026 that she called micro-relinquishments. Small tasks Mum could hand over deliberately, for example, placing place cards under supervision rather than improvising them at the last minute. She practiced the phrasing we all knew, "Would you like to help?" And increasingly, she meant it. There were days when the old compulsion to correct reappeared, as if the habit had a half-life longer than temperament. But those days became less catastrophic and more comical. At a family picnic in June 2026, she adjusted the salt on the potato salad and then, catching her own hands mid-action, burst into guffaws and said, "Old habits die, but they are crusty." The laughter steadied the rest of us. There were also moments that tested the scaffolding more seriously. In September 2026, at a cousin's wedding rehearsal dinner, a photographer unfamiliar with our norms sought to move a centerpiece to improve a shot. Mum, misreading the photographer's aim as an aesthetic affront to her taste, stepped in to reposition the arrangement entirely. The planner, who had been with us since 2018 and who by then knew precisely when to intervene, walked over quietly and said to Mum, "We keep the plan today, you can help by greeting Aunt June." Mum blinked, considered, and then leaned into Aunt June with the kind of theatrical warmth she had perfected in acting classes 40 years earlier. The photographer later emailed a thank you note. The planner sent a one-line message that read, "Everyone did their job and the photos are lovely." The moment was tiny, but in the ledger of repair it counted for a lot. The son's role continued to be decisive. After his high school graduation in 2024, he left for college in the fall, and by 2027 his presence in family logistics had become intermittent but influential. When he came home for holidays, he took the voice of the protocol with a calm authority that cut through the old theater of argument. In July 2027, when Mum began to show signs of increased forgetfulness, misplacing keys, replaying conversations, we convened a careful medical assessment. The neurologist used precise language: mild cognitive impairment, not yet dementia, with recommendations for monitoring, lifestyle changes, and legal readiness. What could have provoked panic instead produced methodical action. We updated documents, scheduled regular check-ins, and agreed to a quarterly family council review. The son took responsibility for keeping a shared calendar and for reminding vendors, when needed, which name to call for directions. These were not merely bureaucratic decisions, they were moral choices about dignity. In November 2027, we met with an elder care attorney to discuss guardianship contingencies. A conversation that felt, at once, like a surrender and a prudent hedge. We framed the guardianship discussion as a last resort instrument, not a first-use hammer. The attorney explained the difference between durable power of attorney, healthcare proxy, and formal guardianship, and we left with a schedule: review POA annually, reassess cognitive function every 6 months with the same neurologist, and only consider guardianship if 2 independent clinicians concurred on incapacity. The language read like a promise to be careful with restraint. For Mum, who had always prized her autonomy, the plan was acceptable precisely because it was bounded by procedure. Meanwhile, the culture outside our family continued to shift. By 2027, several vendors had integrated consent language into their booking platforms. Some photographers added a checkbox that read, "I will confirm my instructions with the designated client of record," and some florists published blog posts about the ethics of event work. An unusual genre of corporate reflection that, to our surprise, foregrounded the emotional dimensions of contract enforcement. These changes echoed the themes of the earlier years, that institutions can both reflect and shape private conduct. What had once been a single florist's refusal at one wedding had rippled into sectoral norms. That ripple did not erase the need for personal amendment, but it made the terrain of reform more navigable.